have another keynote speaker for you today. We have Aaron Tilton. He is the CEO of SmartFi, which he co-founded with a vision to empower users by explaining the confusing nature of cryptocurrencies to a broad audience and making the modern tools of wealth generation accessible to all. We like that, don't we? Aaron is a former Utah State legislator, USA, and president and CEO of Blue Castle Holdings and Power Block Coin. Aaron has chief responsibility to oversee the development of the leading new nuclear plant and project in Western US. Welcome, Aaron.
Hi, thanks for having me. It's a privilege to be here, and I hope there are a couple of things that we can accomplish from this topic. Obviously, the topic of DeFi sheriffs, right? This concept of a sheriff is a historical one that has a lot of parallels to crypto. We're going to explore that, about regulations, also about the design of technology related to that. And so the first thing I think we ought to do is introduce SmartFi. I'm not going to talk a lot about our company. I think people are more interested in hearing maybe some of the insights that we have from our previous experience, which is, and my previous experience as a policymaker, and then also our experience engaging with regulators from the nuclear world, how that applies to crypto and to DeFi, and what lessons can we learn historically from the past as it relates to the adoption of new technologies, the protection of property, the use of that property. And so there's an enormous amount of parallels that with either your project or your use of cryptocurrencies can be very valuable and save you a lot of headache and trouble. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about myself to give you a backstory. As Lavinia said, I was a former state legislator. I was elected in 2004 and then re-elected in 2006. And previous to that, I was actually appointed to that seat, which is kind of a crazy story. I'll tell you about it here in just a minute. But it was I was about 32, so I was a little younger for an elected official, and a little bit of in some respects, it was kind of a sad tale, but a very eye-opening experience of how I got to where I was at that time. Sad for one individual and kind of exciting for me. But so some of the committees that I served on in the state legislature, I was in the House Public Utilities and Technology Committee, was the vice chair, which that committee was involved in regulating utilities that provided electrical services, gas services. I was also on the House Retirement and Independent Entities Committee. Has some parallels to cryptocurrency, obviously investments. People are buying crypto for retirement purposes, and was the vice chair there. And basically we made laws that regulated utilities and how they received their compensation, how people could engage in retirements, and a lot of other things related to the state of Utah. Also, we have a company that is the parent corporation of SmartFi, where we develop a new nuclear power plant in Utah, so here in the Western US. And then obviously, as you can imagine, from those experiences, we've engaged with many state and federal regulators in regards to nuclear power plants or in passing laws to help enable regulators to provide their oversight for public utilities or retirement entities and investment. So a lot of experience there. I think that we've taken from that past and applied it to cryptocurrencies is just very applicable and kind of enlightening when you consider where we are and what's happening in the space. We've seen a lot of potential legislation in proposed bills, one of which the infrastructure bill here in the United States, as it relates to mining and nodes. They're trying to force those entities to take on a role of almost a regulator-like position. And also there was a bill introduced a few days ago that was very sweeping in its proposed regulations for cryptocurrencies, which would actually be very detrimental. And I think it's a little bit of a warning bell that people should be paying attention to this consideration, that as crypto continues to gain more notoriety and a little broader use, it's going to wake up the regulators in this space and the politicians who feel compelled to quote unquote solve problems and basically address what their constituents might have in concern. So with that, let's talk a little bit about this kind of reckoning that we are having and that'll continue to happen. And I liked the concept of sheriffs for this reason. Historically, sheriffs were the outgrowth of the serfs, which are basically the common people. Back in England, about 9th century BC, that word sheriff had its origins there. There was the serfs would appoint or band together to appoint a person called a reeve, and this reeve would basically represent the serfs in an informal way to the king. So when they had complaints about the way the kingdom was being run, or the oppression, or taxes, property, all of those things, he could address the king and try to bring up these issues. And so he was the informal individual who would represent the serfs to the king. And in those days, they had a geographical boundary called a shire. So you might recognize that from Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit. The word shire was kind of a location, like a county comparable in the United States. So the reeve would represent a shire. And over time, they shortened up this connotation to be sheriff. And that's where it evolved into the word sheriff. And it was really an outgrowth of the common people wanting to have reconciliation to the king when he did something that they didn't like. They would protest or go through this sheriff to get it addressed. So that word sheriff has been adopted in a lot of different places around the world as the world kind of developed here in the United States. If you remember the story of Robin Hood, you had the sheriff there, the sheriff of Nottingham, right? And here in the United States, kind of more famous is the sheriff, the image of the Wild West. So when you had homesteaders who had moved from the East Coast in the early days of the United States, they moved west, people would homestead, they would claim property, and they were building up their societies, much like the parallel of in the early days of cryptocurrency when Bitcoin first came out. It was really, Bitcoin was an appeal or a choice, a secondary choice from fiat currency. And this new choice, or this new type of property, eventually was going to be brought up into these policymakers and regulators. So we have a very similar thing that with these new communities that were cropping up across the Western United States, or as a serf in England, in your shire, you had to have a sheriff that would help represent you and protect your property and could actually enforce by violence the protection of that property. And in the Western United States, obviously, this concept took life, and as you became a member of that society or that network, like a cryptocurrency network, or the society that you lived in, a city or a town or a shire, you had to reconcile with that sheriff. And so this concept is centuries old, but we have to learn from these past examples, or we're going to make the same mistakes that occurred then. But these sheriffs are endowed with varying degrees of power, And with this power, you get kind of the good, the bad, and the ugly. To reference a Western movie, and the necessity to evolve from a shire or from a small town with your sheriff into a city or into a metropolitan area, which is really what has to happen for the Wild West. That analogy has been made many times of cryptocurrency, that the cryptocurrency and DeFi is like the Wild West of finance. So what sheriffs do we have? How do we gauge kind of the demands that society might make of this? And I want to give a cautionary tale here as well, that these sheriffs that evolved in England in the 9th century, they were appointed and given power to represent the common person or the serf of that society. But over time, what happened was the king recognized that the people endowed this sheriff with power. And the king then repurposed or structured and gave new power to this sheriff from his side of the ledger to actually make him a tool of the crown. So initially, when the sheriff was built to represent or empowered to represent the common person, the king took that power that sheriff was endowed with by the common people and turned it and used it against them. The sheriff now became a mechanism to collect taxes or fees. And I want to caution you again, the designs of cryptocurrencies have a tax-like feature in transaction fees. And that tyranny of that fee, we've seen that crop up several times, where it became, the fees on the cryptocurrency networks became punitive. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. There are lots of parallels if you really understand this concept. Technology is a sheriff. And it was built, the DeFi technology and cryptocurrency technology was built initially to represent the common man, the ability to engage in your own property and transactions without having to go through the regulatory construct of banking. But over time, you're going to see, as that technology evolves and continues to become more pervasive, that the other sheriffs of the world, politicians and regulators that society has given power to, these conflicting mandates will evolve. And you're seeing it now, that the governments of the world are trying to use the power of cryptocurrencies now to actually serve their purposes. So we're going to talk a little bit about what does that look like, what's the success of this, and how do we engage in a productive way the change of this. What is the good, what's the bad, and what's the ugly of where we find ourselves. So there are a couple of these bullet points here, that DeFi's long-term success requires society's moral acceptance. Society is going to demand, if DeFi is going to be successful long-term, that we embody the moral acceptance and the moral standards of society in general, or they will regulate you out of existence. You've seen what China just recently did with miners in China. Once they decided that those miners no longer serve the purposes of communist China, they outlawed their existence and essentially did away with that function in China. So you're going to see that can happen, and it will happen. So DeFi's early commercial success, it is not the same as societal acceptance. Just because a group of people is making money with crypto or with DeFi, it doesn't necessarily mean, and it shouldn't be accepted, that commercial success means that society is accepting you. It actually only means you might become a bigger target. So, and third, DeFi's broad user adoption. Even though there may be broader acceptance and the use of crypto may become more broad, it is not the same as decentralization. The danger of decentralization is it can turn into mob rule, which is just as terrible as tyranny. There are lessons to be learned from history about cryptocurrency and about the evolution of a new technology. So we're going to talk a little bit about, one, the potential of cryptocurrency, and two, the ability to take those enhancements, integrate that with what society demands, but then also retain its independence and its freedoms. And that's really what cryptocurrency is about. It's about to use your property with freedom and protect your wealth. Similar to the sample, the existence of the shires and the development of the reeve, who later turned into the sheriff, and then the government turned the sheriff into the tool to collect taxes from the serfs. So you've got to be really careful, make sure that you maintain your independence. And that starts with the core designs of the technology. There are a lot of the designs of cryptocurrencies that I question, not because of the intent of cryptocurrencies, but maybe a little bit of the ignorance of the designers, that they weren't really clear on what they were building. They knew that they wanted to replace something, and over time it has to iterate. So let's just talk about what has to happen for these things to be adopted and to avoid becoming a tool of the government or becoming obsolete by not being accepted into society's moral standards. So the three objectives here with the tools are, one, of governance. I think everybody's familiar. If you use cryptocurrencies, you hear that word, governance or DeFi. Two, value fundamentals are very critical. Where does the value from what we're doing come from? What activities does it promote? Does it promote societal standards, or does it promote maybe a little bit of lawlessness? Payment systems. If payment systems become a structure to collect taxes, now you become a tool of the government. Or the system that is collecting those transaction fees can become a tyranny. They can oppress you just as easily as any government does. So we're going to talk about that. So the design of your project, or the design of the use of these assets, must have superior equality and moral designs technically to be accepted by society as a whole, and to keep from becoming a tool of government or becoming a tyranny under their own existence. So without these superior benefits, no technology will survive. It'll either be made illegal by a government, or the users will see that it has become its own tyranny. So in some of these slides, I might blow through. And if you have questions, again, please raise your hand. I can't really see any of these questions yet. I think they're going to save them for the end, so I'll try to save about 10 minutes till the end of this presentation. But I may blow through some of these slides, not address all of these issues, or I may hit some of them selectively. So let me talk a little bit about the experience that I've had, and how you have to kind of change your mindset. When I came into government, and I'll tell you this crazy story a little bit, and I'll try to be quick. My first experience for running for office was over taxes. I thought that there were certain taxes that were punitive and unnecessary, and so I ran on a kind of a less tax platform. And I'm trying to get to the point quickly here. But the guy that I was running against had voted for a tax on cable TV. And I thought, what's the point of that? Why do we need to tax cable TV? Right? And there were a couple other things that he voted to raise taxes on. All in all, was he a terrible guy? No. But there were things I found out about later that made me question his moral judgments. And later the voters punished him for certain things. But so I started running against him, and there's this process where you run for office where you have to first get on the ballot by becoming your party's nominee. I was a member of the Republican Party, still am, and he was the incumbent. So you had to run in this process called a convention to become, and you had to convince certain delegates that you were the good guy for the ballot to then be put on the ballot and then run against the other party's candidate to eventually win the election. So we went through this convention, and I made it by 2 votes, which means I didn't become the candidate outright, but I brought him into a primary election. So now we had to go to this broader election where tens of thousands of people that are members of the party would vote on who was the best candidate. And so I was knocking doors, trying to talk to these people and make sure that they would vote for me, or try to convince them to vote for me, go through this process. And I got a phone call from a newspaper called the Deseret News, which was a statewide newspaper that basically wanted an interview. And I said, hey, I'm knocking doors right now. I can't talk to you, but yeah, I'll talk to you later. So anyways, later on that day, we talked, and he said, I wanted to congratulate you on you're becoming the state representative. And I said, well, wait a minute, but the campaign's still going on. I haven't won. You must be confused. And he said, no, let me explain to you something. We're going to be breaking a story about your opponent tomorrow, and I need to get your reaction that he was arrested 4 months previous. This was in springtime, and he said in later end of last year, he was arrested for solicitation of a prostitute, undercover cop who was posing as a prostitute, and he pled not guilty, or pled no contest, and was convicted, and hoping that nobody would find this out about him, and still running and still fulfilling his office. And he's agreed that he's going to resign. And since you're the only other person running against him, you're it. You won. And I was shocked at first. Then I was saddened, because I thought, man, this guy has got, tomorrow his world is going to implode. And, you kind of feel a little bit of sad for him that he made such a stupid choice and behaved in such a stupid manner, one morally, but also publicly. His life was about to change dramatically and be incredibly embarrassed, all of these things. But at the same time, I thought, well, if you're going to be a public official, you need to be beyond reproach. You need to exhibit in your personal life and your public life a moral standard that people will accept. And not only just for public appearances, but if you're putting yourself out to be a guiding leader like cryptocurrency and the DeFi space, you better live up to the standards that society expects of you and the users and or the people who will vote for you and support you. You cannot have a double standard. So that was my crazy experience in my first experience into politics, about how brutal it can be. And the same thing with DeFi and cryptocurrency. If you have some success with your platform and using it, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be accepted by society. You got to be very careful. And the designs of what you're doing have to exhibit the moral standards of society. So here are kind of these 5 points I want to get to. And one, some kinds of success in politics are not measured by those who agree with you. It's measured by those who are not rewarded for opposing you. Very different. You find out pretty quick in politics, the enemy of my enemy is my friend kind of thing. And or you don't always know people's motivations. And as long as you can get people to not actively oppose you, that's just as good as winning and getting them on your side. Number two, regulators and policymakers already have an ideology and a constituent influence that you'll not be able to influence. Doesn't matter how persuasive you are, how good your product is, all of these things, they may never agree with you, even though personally they might like what you're doing. If their constituency and their voters have an interest that is contrary to your product, your goal is just not to make an enemy of them. You will never convince them to support you. What you need to do is get them not to oppose you. So that goes along with number 3. Design your product so that the benefit of your product will not allow anybody the opportunity to publicly oppose you. You're trying to frame a debate and capture the public narrative that supports you so that number 4 can be possible. If somebody decides to oppose you, you limit their forum for opposition. Your product is so good, has obvious benefits to the voters and to the constituency, that if they privately oppose you because they don't agree with your position or whatever it is, or maybe this, maybe one of the sheriffs, a senator or a House member, his wife is the CEO of a large bank. He's never going to like cryptocurrencies, right? So what you need to do is make it impossible or very difficult for him to publicly oppose you because you've gained superior moral narrative, right? And that is something that DeFi and cryptocurrency have not done. We've done a very poor job of doing that. It is okay to publicly oppose cryptocurrencies and badmouth it and do all these things because we'll talk about that we have not captured the moral imperative and made that narrative of superior moral design clear. And 5, politicians and regulators will find easier targets if your project has obvious moral virtues and just not technological innovation. Technology itself is not a virtue. And we see a lot of, because this community involves a heavy technical design, developers, they can often get confused that technology is actually a virtue, right? And it is not. Technology is not a virtue in and of itself. It is the choice of using your property and the freedoms that it presents and all of these other things that are the virtues that we need to capture the narrative. So let's learn a little bit of from the past history. I'm gonna look at my time here and make sure that I'm not running over. I'm gonna move on because we're gonna need to provide time for some questions. But parallels from the past, we talk about the Wild West. In the early days, pioneers banded together in governance and appoint sheriffs to enforce the laws. When you select a cryptocurrency like Bitcoin or Ethereum or something else, you're actually selecting a sheriff because you're operating with inside a network. I think of it like a little town or a community. We use that term a lot. And the internet also did the same thing, but its debate was framed a lot differently, as it should have been, because many of the virtues of that that structure and that innovation were awesome, massive, life-changing, history-making, nothing like it in history. But it came with a lot of downside that nobody really talks about, one of which is the massive amount of use of power. You hear that in mining of cryptocurrencies. The internet in 2013 used 107 nuclear power plants worth of electricity. You never hear somebody complain and say, we need to shut off the internet because it uses too much electricity. Nobody's ever said that I can find out, right? It facilitates massive fraud, theft, and privacy abuse, pornography. And the reason for its political support is politicians use it to exploit it for political gain. They have just as much a right or intrinsic need to use it as anybody else to get their message out. I'm going to kind of blow through this slide a little bit. We've talked about this already. Crypto has allowed criminal elements to thrive in the absence of accountability. Just like an old Wild West town, if there's no sheriff, the guys who wear the black hats reign, right? And when I make reference to white or black, I'm not talking about color or race or anything. It's a movie reference that in the Wild West presentation of the wild movies in the Wild West, the sheriff wore a white hat, the criminals wore a black hat, right? And you hear that reference all the time in technology developers, right? Or hackers, a white hat hacker or a black hack, right? So similarities are politicians will call for overly broad restrictions. You have boom and bust cycles like the gold rush of 1847. Sometimes the cure that the sheriffs try to impose is worse than the disease. The technology sheriffs can collect too much in the form of transaction fees or taxes, right? And so you've got to define, are you a hero or a villain? If your role is unclear, that is not a good prospect for you to be engaging sheriffs or policymakers. So you've got to show that your core designs meet society's moral narratives. Here are the problems with cryptocurrencies and DeFi in general. There's a lack of fundamentals, right? It's seen as kind of a get rich quick story, right? And people, although they might like to be the beneficiaries of that, if the other side of the population is not getting rich quick, they see you as a villain because somehow you've taken from them what they should have had. It's kind of a jealousy in its finest form. And so if your beneficiaries have a small use case and the natural constituent is really small, you're a target for regulation. And the use case is really currently around cryptocurrencies and DeFi centered around trading and speculation, kind of the same thing. Most people can't spend all their time becoming a trader. Most day traders of cryptocurrencies and regular stocks, they actually, 85% of them lose all their money within the first year, right? Or lose a lot of money in the first year. So 3, unnecessary bear market volatility. There are victims and winners from negative, unnecessary bear market volatility. That narrative it goes way up and everybody's happy, and then it crashes and then everybody's sad. You're making yourself a target for regulation when you have that kind of structure. So and also with cryptocurrencies, there's no solution for injustices like theft or fraud or errors on the blockchain. There's no ability to go back and right the wrongs, like go to court or do these other things. And blockchain use requires perfection of users. 20%, it's estimated that 20% of all Bitcoin is locked in wallets that people have lost the access to their private keys. Nobody would accept that in regular society. If you went to a bank and they said, hey, there's a potential, in fact, it's highly likely if you put in $100, you're only going to be able to access maybe 80% of it. You're going to lose 20% in our bank. That's just the stats, one of which, because we require you to use our platform perfectly. If you can't remember your password, too bad. That's not acceptable in society, right? So the designs of cryptocurrencies and at the core and DeFi have a lot of drawbacks. This is just not acceptable, so it won't be accepted in society. So we also talk about unnecessary taxes or fees. And ironically, the core designs of cryptocurrencies borrowed the worst features of banking and government tyranny. Fees for using your own property. That's not freedom. That's oppression, right? Socialized block rewards. No matter how big the notional value is on the network, the same reward is split among the same network operators, like socialism. That's not a good design, right? And we'll talk about some of those impacts, but I'm going to try to move on here and get to kind of the virtues and kind of the designs. We already talked about that, the value or the virtue in crypto is in choice. We have to capture that narrative and make sure that that's communicated. You need to frame the debate with benefits, right? The long-term benefits, we talked a little bit about this, need to be clear. Nobody's really clear on what is the long-term view of cryptocurrencies and DeFis. Everybody's clear that short-term, a lot of people are making money. There's a lot of risk. And when I say a lot, the small amount of people who engage in it make money, but nobody's really clear about that. You need to meet with the sheriff and make sure that the long-term benefits are clear. If these values cannot be communicated, right, and your project cannot communicate these values, you're going to go the way of the dodo bird, right, which is essentially extinct. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. I'm going to try to tell you how do you frame the debate? And I'm going to give you some of the examples of SmartFi. Some of the things that we've done in our core designs, and we've spent 4 years designing this from that perspective. We're a user. We've been the victim of a lot of other things. We've had people steal things from us. We've had other problems, incorrect transactions or a lot of these other things in our early days of learning how to use the network and cryptocurrencies. So we designed our system to overcome these problems, one of which is we built natural constituencies into the form of our loans, small business loans. We don't make a lot of loans to people to leverage in the marketplace to trade on. We make most of our loans to people who are building a business. Those business owners are natural constituents for politicians. Traders are not. It's just a fact, right? Also, we have a 100% buyback guarantee that if you buy our token, you don't like it for any reason at the end of a year, you can come back to us, give us the token. If you buy it from us in our token sale, we'll give you back exactly your money that you bought it with, because we have a different design. We don't rely on speculation in our process. We rely on a hedge. I won't bore you with the detail of how that works, but that is awesome, right? That's a great benefit. It's hard for a politician to say, hey, you have risk in your product. No, we have a way to compensate for that risk. There's risk in it, but we have a way for the natural constituent to hedge that risk. We have a fundamental value creation. Our structure and our platform works off of a lending model, and we index our coin to the lending platform so it can produce its own forward price curve. People can tell what we're going to be worth in the future, and that resists bear market volatility or unnecessary bear market volatility. In 6 months, we're going to be enacting what we call our sheriff nodes. Surprise, surprise, using that language or that name. That'll help correct fraud, theft, and errors. Now, there'll be a process to it. I'm going to kind of ignore the rest of these bullets because I think I need to kind of release some of this time for questions if there are any. But the sheriff nodes are an innovation from an experience that I had as a legislator. In litigation, there's a process where you have to post a bond. And if you post a bond and engage somebody in litigation, and it shows that your set of facts represented what was true, and you truly were engaged in litigation fraudulently or without cause, you then can either post the bond and then get that back, and then the other person has to pay you, and you win in court or whatever happens, and vice versa. So we've basically structured a process where you can appeal a transaction, but you have to post a bond. You have to put something at risk. So using the same innovative technology of putting something at risk, which is the core of cryptocurrencies, you can do the same thing, but outside of the block, and then get an appeal process, and then have a node that will actually reverse a transaction if you go through a process that takes time, requires you to post more money or value at risk. So you better be sure, if you're trying to reverse this process or this transaction on the blockchain, one, you better be correct, or you're going to have even greater punishment. So it's going to deter thieves and fraudsters from actually engaging in this activity on our blockchain, but give somebody it a way that takes time, could be hard, but give them a way to actually correct an error where it just may be a mistake, or you lost access to your wallet, or whatever it was. So these benefits that we've incorporated in what we're doing give us a better narrative when we're talking to legislators and other policymakers and other sheriffs about how we're different and what the future holds for what we're doing. They can catch a vision. They can see that society, those types of reconciliation processes, reconciling to these sheriffs is possible. And they can see how our products will fit into the narrative of society. So we feel that if you don't do this, if you don't engage this in your technology from the design, from the outset, you're opening yourself up to unnecessary risk. And there are ways to innovate this around technology and keep cryptocurrencies ethos and the DeFi ethos intact, but it takes a lot of work. And you can't just accept the status quo of errors, fraud, and theft being part of your business model. So with that, I'm going to end there.
Aaron, thank you so much for your time and your presentation.
Thank you.